exploring history for sleep, what rich people ate in medieval times. Welcome to another boring journey through history. Tonight, we're taking an extended exploration of medieval cookery and mealtimes in 12th century France. Over the next 2 hours, we'll move slowly and thoroughly through the intricate world of castle kitchens, feast preparation, and dining customs, examining each detail with the kind of comprehensive depth that helps your mind settle into sleep. Picture, if you will, the great castle of St. Aliquis, where we'll spend our evening learning about how our medieval ancestors prepared, served, and consumed their daily bread. We'll explore the vast preparations required for a noble wedding feast, the everyday rhythms of castle dining, the fascinating variety of foods available to different social classes, and the elaborate customs that governed every aspect of medieval hospitality. The grand preparation, organizing a medieval feast, planning the impossible. When we consider the logistics of feeding several thousand people in an age without refrigeration, without modern transportation, and without any of the conveniences we take for granted today, we begin to appreciate the remarkable organizational skills of medieval castle administrators. Imagine, if you will, a noblewoman named Adela, wife to Baron Conon of St. Aliquis, as she contemplates the monumental task ahead of her, preparing for her daughter's wedding feast. The very first consideration, after ensuring proper attire for the celebration, was always food and drink. This wasn't simply a matter of ordering catering or visiting a grocery store. Instead, it required coordinating a complex web of suppliers, hunters, gatherers, and craftspeople, all working in harmony to produce a feast worthy of the occasion. Adela's first step was always to summon the butler and the cellarer, two of the most important servants in any medieval household. The butler, contrary to our modern understanding of the role, was responsible for the castle's wine cellars and all beverages. The cellarer managed the storage of food supplies, maintaining the vast underground vaults that kept the castle's inhabitants fed throughout the year. Together, these two men would conduct a thorough inventory of everything stored in the great vaults beneath the castle. These storage areas were marvels of medieval engineering and organization. Picture massive stone chambers, cool and dry, filled with enormous barrels of wine, sacks of grain, wheels of cheese aging slowly in the darkness, and great vats of salted meat, preserved against winter shortages or potential sieges. The smell would have been overwhelming to modern sensibilities, a complex mixture of fermentation, aging cheese, preserved meats, and the earthy dampness of stone chambers. Mobilizing the countryside. Once the existing supplies had been assessed, the real work began. The chief huntsman received orders to muster all his beaters and organize hunting expeditions throughout the forest lands belonging to the castle. This wasn't recreational hunting, but rather a systematic harvesting of the wild game that would form the centerpiece of any respectable medieval feast. Consider for a moment the scale of this operation. The hunting parties would spread out across thousands of acres of forest land, using techniques refined over generations. They would employ everything from nets and snares to elaborate drives where dozens of men would move through the forest, herding game toward waiting hunters with crossbows and spears. The variety of animals they sought was remarkable by modern standards, not just deer and wild boar, but also smaller game like rabbits, various birds from tiny songbirds to magnificent swans, and even creatures we might find surprising on a dinner table, such as herons, cranes, and storks. Simultaneously, other preparations were underway, Nets were deployed in the River Clare to catch the fish that would supplement the meat courses. These weren't simple fishing expeditions, but rather organized efforts using large nets that could capture substantial quantities of fish at once. The types of fish available included barbel and eels from the river itself, carp from nearby ponds, and the prize trout from the brooks that fed into the larger river. Supply networks and trade. The castle's procurement efforts extended far beyond its own lands. Purveyors with their heavy carts received orders to travel to Pont-de-Bois, gathering supplies that couldn't be produced locally. These journeys were significant undertakings in themselves, involving days of travel over roads that were often little more than muddy tracks. The carts would return laden with specialty items, perhaps exotic spices, particular types of flour, or preserved foods that were regional specialties. For truly special occasions, the procurement network extended even further. A messenger might be dispatched all the way to Troyes, a journey that could take several days each way, to procure a ton of rare Grecian wine. This single barrel of wine represented a considerable expense, equivalent perhaps to what a skilled craftsman might earn in several months. The very fact that such wine was imported from the Mediterranean demonstrates the sophisticated trade networks that connected even relatively remote castles to the wider medieval world. The wine trade itself was a complex affair. Greek wines, particularly those from islands like Cyprus and Lesbos, were highly prized for their strength and distinctive flavors. They arrived in northern France through a chain of merchants that might include Italian traders, Alpine passes, river barges, and finally, the carts that brought them to castle doors. Each step in this journey added to the cost, making such wines true luxury items reserved for the most important occasions. The army of temporary workers. No castle kitchen, however well staffed, could handle the preparation required for a major feast without additional help. All available maids from the surrounding villages would be requisitioned to help with the enormous task of making pasties, those elaborate meat pies that were among the most prized dishes of medieval cuisine. Picture these village women arriving at the castle in the early morning hours, their hands already skilled in the arts of pastry-making from their daily bread baking. They would work in shifts throughout the day and night, rolling out vast quantities of dough, preparing fillings that might include multiple types of meat, and carefully constructing the elaborate pastries that would serve as centerpieces for the feast. The sheer quantities involved were staggering. A single large pasty might contain several chickens, multiple game birds, bacon, and various seasonings, all encased in a crust that served both as cooking vessel and serving dish. The ovens would run continuously, with careful attention paid to temperature and timing. A pasty that baked too quickly might burn on the outside while remaining raw in the center, while one that baked too slowly might become soggy and unappetizing. Importing expertise. For the most elaborate dishes, even the castle's regular kitchen staff wasn't sufficient. A master cook might be imported from a major city like Paris, bringing with him the knowledge of the latest fashions in cooking and the skills necessary to create the most impressive presentations. These master cooks were artists in their own right, capable of creating elaborate molded dishes that were as much visual spectacle as culinary delight. They knew the secrets of making jellies that would hold elaborate shapes, of preparing sauces that would complement specific combinations of meats, and of timing complex cooking operations so that dozens of different dishes would all be ready at precisely the right moment. The arrival of such a master cook was an event in itself. He would inspect the castle's kitchen facilities, assess the available ingredients, and begin planning the sequence of preparations that would culminate in the feast. His knowledge extended beyond simple cooking to include the elaborate customs of service, the proper way to present dishes to noble guests, and the symbolic meanings of various foods and preparations. The medieval kitchen, technology and technique. The heart of culinary operations. The kitchen of a great medieval castle was a complex industrial operation, far removed from the cozy domestic kitchens we might imagine. The main fireplace in the Bailey cookhouse was a massive stone structure, large enough that a person could easily walk inside it. This fireplace served multiple purposes simultaneously: roasting, boiling, and even baking, depending on how the fires were arranged and maintained. For major feasts, even this substantial facility proved insufficient. Additional cooking fires would be built in the open air, in the tilt yard or castle gardens. Picture these outdoor cooking areas, great logs burning under iron spits that held whole animals, massive cauldrons suspended over roaring fires, and perspiring servants feeding the flames throughout the day and night. The spit roasting process was both an art and a science. The spits, long iron rods that might hold multiple chickens, geese, or even entire young pigs, had to be turned constantly to ensure even cooking. This was typically the job of the lowest-ranking kitchen servants, often young boys who would spend their entire day turning the heavy spits by hand. The heat was intense, and the work was monotonous, but it was also essential. Meat that was unevenly cooked might spoil quickly in an age without refrigeration. Tools of the trade. Inside the main cookhouse, the master cook commanded an impressive arsenal of specialized tools and equipment. His collection would rival that of any modern professional kitchen, though the tools themselves were quite different from their contemporary counterparts. The basic cooking vessels included pots of various sizes, made from copper, iron, or sometimes even silver, for the most delicate preparations. Trivets, three-legged stands, held pots at the proper height above the coals. A mortar and pestle, essential for grinding spices and preparing sauces, might be carved from a single piece of stone and could weigh as much as a person. The preparation areas included specialized tables for different tasks, one for mincing herbs, with surfaces scarred by countless knife cuts, another for rolling pastry, kept scrupulously clean and dusted with flour, and a third for butchering meat, with channels carved to direct blood away from the work surface. Hanging from hooks and arranged on shelves were the smaller tools of the cook's trade: pot hooks for suspending vessels over the fire, cauldrons of various sizes for different types of stews and soups, frying pans beaten from iron and carefully seasoned to prevent sticking, gridirons for cooking over direct heat, and an array of saucepans for the delicate work of sauce making. Among the more specialized equipment was a pepper mill, a valuable item in an age when pepper was worth more than its weight in silver. There were dressing boards for carving meat, skimmers for removing foam and impurities from broths, ladles of various sizes for serving, and countless other implements, each designed for specific culinary tasks. The kitchen hierarchy. The medieval kitchen operated under a strict hierarchy that reflected the broader social structure of castle life. At the top was the master cook, a figure of considerable authority, who might hold a position equivalent to a minor nobleman. Below him were various specialist cooks responsible for different aspects of meal preparation: the roast cook who managed the spits and open fires, the sauce cook who prepared the complex condiments that were so important to medieval cuisine, and the pastry cook who created the elaborate baked goods that were such an important part of any feast. At the bottom of this hierarchy were the kitchen boys, often local villagers' sons who worked in exchange for food and the possibility of learning a trade. These boys faced hard labor and frequent punishment, but they also received benefits that made their positions desirable despite the harsh conditions. They were allowed to lick the pans clean after cooking, giving them access to rich foods that would otherwise be far beyond their reach. They could gnaw on scraps of meat and taste the elaborate sauces and pastries that graced noble tables. The kitchen boys' duties were varied and demanding. They fed the fires that had to burn continuously, hauled water from wells or streams, carried heavy pots and cauldrons, cleaned the endless array of cooking implements, and served as assistants to the higher-ranking cooks. The work was hot, dangerous, and exhausting, but it provided a path to advancement that few other occupations offered to boys of humble birth. Preservation and storage. In an age without refrigeration, the preservation and storage of food presented constant challenges. The primary method of meat preservation was salting, and every castle maintained large vats filled with meat packed in salt. These preservation chambers were carefully maintained, with the salt regularly refreshed and the stored meat checked for signs of spoilage. The salting process itself was both art and science. Different cuts of meat required different treatments. Some needed only a light salting for short-term preservation, while others were packed heavily in salt for long-term storage that might last through an entire winter or a prolonged siege. The quality of the salt itself mattered enormously. The finest salt was imported from coastal regions and was expensive enough that its use was carefully regulated. Vegetables were preserved through a variety of methods. Root vegetables like turnips and carrots could be stored in cool, dry cellars for months. Cabbages were often fermented into an early form of sauerkraut. Herbs were dried and stored in carefully sealed containers to preserve their flavors and medicinal properties. The storage areas beneath the castle were engineering marvels in their own right. These underground chambers maintained relatively constant temperatures throughout the year, staying cool in summer and avoiding freezing in winter. They were carefully designed to prevent moisture from damaging stored goods, while also preventing them from becoming too dry. The bounty of land and water, medieval food sources. The primacy of meat. Medieval aristocratic cuisine was fundamentally centered around meat, and the variety of animals considered suitable for noble tables was remarkable by modern standards. Beef and mutton formed the foundation of most meals, but these common meats were often overshadowed by more exotic game that demonstrated both the wealth and hunting prowess of the castle's lord. The preparation of beef and mutton was often a same-day affair due to the lack of refrigeration. Picture, if you will, a village butcher arriving at a town late in the day, securing lodging at the local priest's house. To pay for his accommodations, he might slaughter a sheep that very evening, providing fresh mutton for supper. This immediacy was necessary, but also desirable. Medieval palates, while perhaps less sensitive to what we might consider spoilage, still preferred the taste and texture of freshly killed meat. Pork held a special place in medieval cuisine, not least because pigs served multiple functions beyond simply providing meat. Baron Conan's great droves of hogs fattened in his oak forests, feeding on the abundant crops of acorns that fell each autumn. This created a natural cycle where the pigs converted otherwise unusable acorns into valuable protein, while simultaneously serving as the castle's waste disposal system. The ubiquity of pigs in medieval life was remarkable. They roamed freely through castle courtyards and town streets, serving as living garbage disposals that consumed kitchen scraps, human waste, and any other organic matter they encountered. This sanitation role was so important that pigs were allowed to penetrate almost everywhere except the private chambers of the lord and lady. Yet this intimate relationship between humans and pigs occasionally turned deadly. In 1131, the Crown Prince of France met his end in Paris when a pig ran between the legs of his horse as he rode from the Hôtel de Ville to the Church of Saint-Gervais. This incident, while tragic, illustrates just how thoroughly pigs were integrated into the fabric of medieval urban life. Despite widespread beliefs that pork promoted leprosy, a genuine concern in an age when the disease was both common and incurable, people continued to consume it enthusiastically. Pork formed the main substance of the great sausages and black puddings that were particularly popular during Easter celebrations, when the end of Lenten fasting was marked by consuming as much rich, heavy food as possible. Veal was highly prized for its tenderness, as was the flesh of young goats. Lamb, interestingly, was not as favored as we might expect, perhaps because sheep were more valuable for their wool than their meat, in an economy where textiles were extremely valuable commodities. The world of fowl. The medieval appetite for birds of all kinds was truly remarkable, encompassing species that modern diners would find shocking or inedible. Among the most prized were large wading birds, herons, cranes, storks, and cormorants. These birds were particularly valued if they had been taken by hawks, as the hunting method was considered to add to their prestige and flavor. Even birds that we would consider scavengers or pests were welcome at medieval tables. Crows were considered very fair eating, and the great flocks of ravens that gathered around castles and battlefields provided a readily available source of protein. The medieval palate was far less squeamish than our own, and necessity often overrode what we might consider aesthetic considerations. The castle's elegant swans, kept by the mouth of the Rapide River, existed primarily for the kitchen rather than for ornament. These magnificent birds would be prepared for the most important feasts, often presented in elaborate fashion that emphasized their beauty even in death. The preparation of swan was an art form in itself, with the birds sometimes presented as if they were still alive and swimming, their beaks gilded and their bodies silvered. Small birds provided constant protein for castle tables. Thrushes, starlings, blackbirds, quail, partridges, and even cuckoos could be brought down by servants armed with crossbows and snares. Young rabbits were welcome additions to the menu, though older rabbits were considered too tough for any but the lowest-ranking servants. This gave rise to the saying, "An old hare and an old goose are food for the devil." The castle's domestic poultry represented a significant investment and source of pride. Chickens destined for important feasts were fattened by being shut up in dark coops and force-fed, a process that produced birds of exceptional size and richness. The arrival of geese from the fields was itself a spectacle, great honking armies crowding the narrow castle approaches, hissing and biting, but all propelled steadily ahead by the cracking whips of small goose girls who had mastered the art of herding these temperamental birds. Peacocks held the highest place in the hierarchy of feast birds. These magnificent creatures were considered especially suitable as food for the brave, and their preparation and presentation were elaborate affairs. The peacock might be roasted and then reassembled with its full plumage, creating a dish that was as much artistic display as culinary achievement. There was even an old proverb that thieves have as much taste for falsehood as a hungry man for a cooked peacock, reflecting both the desirability of the dish and its rarity. The religious complexity of food. Medieval cuisine was profoundly shaped by religious considerations that seem almost impossibly complex to modern minds. Most Christians believed that birds were of aquatic origin, and therefore, like fish, could be eaten on fast days when meat was forbidden. This theological position was hotly debated and gradually overturned by church authorities, but the transition was slow and often contentious. The rules governing eggs and butter during Lent were particularly intricate. Theologians had declared that hens were aquatic creatures, making their eggs permissible during times when meat was forbidden. However, butter faced different restrictions. It could be eaten during periods of abstinence only if it was freshly churned, unsalted, and not used for cooking purposes. These religious dietary restrictions created a parallel cuisine that was every bit as elaborate as the meat-based feasts of ordinary times. A typical fast day banquet might begin with roast apples, garnished with sorrel and rosemary, followed by rich soups made from multiple types of fish: trout, herring, eels that had been salted for exactly 24 hours, and salt whiting soaked for precisely 12 hours would be combined with almonds, ginger, saffron, and cinnamon powder to create complex and flavorful dishes. When possible, fresh ocean fish would be brought inland: soles, congers, turbots, and salmon, though these were often available only in salted form by the time they reached inland castles. Rivers provided their own bounty: pike, preferably with roe, carp, and bream. Side dishes might include lampreys, porpoise, mackerel, and shad, often served with sauces made from crab apple juice, rice, and fried almonds. The fruits of garden and forest. While medieval noble cuisine was heavily focused on meat, vegetables played important supporting roles, particularly for the poorer members of society who could afford meat only on special occasions. Castle gardens and the surrounding countryside provided a surprising variety of vegetables, including almost everything familiar to modern gardens except the potato, which would not arrive in Europe for several more centuries. Onions and garlic were fundamental to medieval cooking, providing both flavor and preservation qualities that were particularly valued in an age without refrigeration. Cabbages came in several varieties: Roman white cabbages, huge Easter cabbages, and the especially prized scentless cabbages, renowned for their excellent aroma. These vegetables were often fermented or pickled to preserve them through the winter months. Root vegetables formed a crucial part of the medieval diet. Turnips were particularly favored and appeared in many more dishes than they would in later centuries. Carrots, beets, and parsnips provided essential nutrition during the long winter months when fresh foods were scarce. Artichokes, considered a delicacy, were grown in the finest castle gardens. Legumes provided crucial protein for those who couldn't afford meat regularly. Lentils, both long and broad beans, and peas were dietary staples that could be dried and stored through the winter. These crops also played an important role in agriculture, as their ability to fix nitrogen in the soil made them valuable for maintaining soil fertility in an age before chemical fertilizers. Leafy vegetables included lettuce, parsley, and watercress, often combined into salads that were particularly popular during Lent. Cucumbers were grown, despite beliefs that they could cause fever, a testament to their popularity. and the gardener's confidence in their cultivation methods. The herb garden was perhaps the most important part of any castle's food production system. Here grew the marjoram, sage, and sweet basil that flavored soups and stews. More exotic spices had to be imported at great expense, but a well-maintained herb garden could provide most of the flavoring needed for daily cooking. The staff of life, bread and grains. The social hierarchy of bread. Perhaps no single food item better illustrated the rigid social hierarchies of medieval life than bread. The type of bread one ate immediately proclaimed one's social status, wealth, and position in the feudal system. At the bottom of this hierarchy, the villeins, unfree peasants bound to the land, were forced to make do with bread made from barley, rye, or oats, producing a coarse, dark loaf that nobles regarded with horror and revulsion. The darkness of peasant bread came not just from the types of grain used, but also from the coarseness of the grinding and the inclusion of various adulterants that were added to make the limited grain supplies stretch further. Peasants might add ground beans, peas, or even tree bark to their flour, creating loaves that were nutritious but heavy and difficult to digest. In stark contrast, one of the clearest signs of Baron Conan's prosperity and generous nature was that all members of his household, down to the lowest servants, ordinarily ate white bread made from wheat flour. This was an extraordinary luxury that set St. Aleki apart from many other castles, where even the servants might have to content themselves with brown bread made from mixed grains. The castle ovens produced an impressive variety of breads, each designed for specific purposes and social ranks. The largest and most impressive were the Pope's, or knight's, loaves, massive round breads that could weigh several pounds each. These were followed by smaller squire's loaves, and finally, the little varlet's loaves, or rolls, that were appropriate for the lowest-ranking members of the castle community. Specialty breads showcased the baker's skills and the castle's wealth. Soft bread made with milk and butter was reserved for the most honored guests and special occasions. Dog bread, coarser and less refined, fed the castle's considerable population of hunting hounds and working dogs. Two-color bread, with alternating layers of wheat and rye, was as much an artistic achievement as a culinary one, demonstrating the baker's technical skill. The ritual of table loaves. Table loaves served a function that modern diners might find surprising. These were sizable pieces of bread spread around the dining tables, not primarily for eating, but for use in an elaborate social ritual that demonstrated courtesy and proper breeding. Courteous cavaliers would carefully cut away all the crust with their knives, then pass the remainder to the ladies who were their dinner companions. These ladies would then soak the bread in their soup or use it to absorb the rich sauces that accompanied medieval dishes. The bread served as both plate and utensil, soaking up flavors and providing a way to consume every drop of the expensive and carefully prepared foods. This practice was both practical and symbolic, demonstrating the cavalier's attention to his lady's comfort and the lady's appreciation of his courtesy. The servants, while still enjoying wheaten bread, received what was termed common bread, less refined than the table loaves, but still a considerable luxury by the standards of the outside world. This bread was baked in larger batches and with less individual attention, but it was still far superior to what most of the population ate on a daily basis. Preservation and military considerations. The castle's bread production had to take into account not just daily consumption, but also the possibility of siege warfare. Twice-baked breads, or crackers, were produced specifically for long-term storage. These hard, dry loaves could last for months without spoiling, making them ideal for military campaigns or for maintaining the castle during extended sieges. Monasteries were particularly skilled in the production of these preserved breads, as their residents needed to maintain stable food supplies despite seasonal variations in grain production. The monastic communities often served as centers of innovation in food preservation techniques, sharing their knowledge with the secular nobility, who depended on similar methods for military preparedness. The process of creating twice-baked bread was labor-intensive, but crucial for medieval food security. The bread was first baked normally, then sliced, and returned to the ovens at lower temperatures to remove all remaining moisture. The resulting crackers were nearly indestructible and could provide sustenance when no other food was available. Sweet luxuries and exotic flavors. The Spice Revolution. The medieval palate had developed an almost insatiable appetite for spices, a taste that had grown dramatically following the First Crusade's introduction of European nobles to the flavors of the East. The quantity of spices used in medieval cooking was simply enormous by modern standards, transforming familiar ingredients into exotic and expensive delicacies. Pepper was the king of spices, so valuable that it was often used as currency and stored with the same care as precious metals. To enjoy food, heavily charged with pepper, was an acquired taste that immediately proclaimed one's wealth and sophistication. The pepper trade connected medieval Europe to distant lands, India, Southeast Asia, and the mysterious Spice Islands, through complex networks of merchants who risked their lives and fortunes to bring these precious seasonings to European tables. Beyond pepper, medieval cooks employed an arsenal of other spices and flavorings. Mustard was used liberally, both as a condiment and as a cooking ingredient. Garlic formed the base of many favorite sauces, creating rich, pungent accompaniments that enhanced the flavors of meat and vegetables alike. The import trade brought additional luxuries from southern regions. Fresh and pickled olives arrived from Provence, along with olive oil that was prized for both cooking and medicinal purposes. However, olive oil was so expensive that most cooking was done with oils extracted from walnuts or even poppies, creating distinctive flavors that defined regional cuisines. The art of rosewater. One of the most distinctive flavoring agents in medieval cuisine was rosewater, a product that required careful preparation and considerable expertise to produce properly. Throughout the month of June, great basins of water, filled with rose petals, could be seen steeping in the sun throughout the castle grounds. This process extracted the essential oils and fragrances from the petals, creating a liquor that would add zest to sauces for the next 12 months. The preparation of rosewater was both science and art. The timing had to be perfect. Too little steeping, and the water would lack sufficient flavor. Too much, and the delicate rose essence would be overwhelmed by bitterness. The rose petals themselves had to be selected at the perfect moment of bloom, when their oil content was highest and their fragrance most intense. Rose water served multiple purposes in medieval cuisine. It could be added to sauces to provide a delicate floral note that complemented rich meats. It was used in the preparation of sweets and pastries, creating confections that were as much perfume as food. It even had medicinal applications, as medieval medical theory held that pleasant aromas could help balance the body's humors and promote health. The mysterious sweetener. Among the most exotic and expensive ingredients available to medieval cooks was a whitish substance known simply as sugar. This remarkable material came from the Levant in small, irregular lumps that looked almost like crystals or precious stones. Its flavoring qualities were considered absolutely delightful, but it was far too expensive for regular use in cooking. The sugar available to medieval Europeans was quite different from the refined white substance we know today. It was partially refined cane sugar, still containing molasses and other impurities that gave it a complex, rich flavor. The refining process was primitive and labor-intensive, making sugar one of the most expensive commodities in medieval trade. At important feasts like the wedding banquet at Saint-Aliquois, small quantities of sugar would be passed among the higher-ranking guests to be eaten as a confection. This was a mark of extraordinary hospitality, as the cost of sugar was comparable to that of precious spices or fine wines. Each guest would receive only a small piece, to be savored slowly and appreciated as much for its rarity as for its sweetness. For ordinary sweetening purposes, medieval cooks relied on honey, just as the Greeks and Romans had done centuries before. The monastery's well-kept beehives provided a steady supply of this golden sweetener, which was not only more affordable than sugar, but also believed to have medicinal properties. Different types of honey had different flavors, depending on the flowers the bees had visited, creating a variety of taste experiences that skilled cooks could exploit in their recipes. Cheese, the everyday luxury. While cheeses rarely appeared at grand feasts, they played a crucial role in everyday medieval diet. On fast days, when meat was forbidden, cheese often served as the primary source of protein and richness. The varieties available were legion, ranging from simple white cheeses made from cow's milk to complex aged varieties that had developed distinctive flavors and textures. Medieval cheesemaking was a highly skilled craft that varied dramatically from region to region. Some areas produced cheeses that became famous throughout France and were exported widely, commanding premium prices in distant markets. In Paris, street vendors would walk through the neighborhoods, chanting advertisements for their wares. "Buy my cheese from Champagne," or "my cheese from Brie." The storage and aging of cheese required considerable expertise and investment. Castle cellars maintained stocks of cheese at various stages of aging, from fresh white cheeses that would be consumed within days, to hard, aged varieties that could last for months. The investment in time and storage space made fine cheese a valuable commodity that reflected the wealth and sophistication of its owner. Different cheeses served different purposes in medieval cuisine. Fresh, soft cheeses might be eaten with bread as a simple meal, or incorporated into pastries and other cooked dishes. Aged, hard cheeses could be grated over other foods, or eaten in small quantities as a concentrated source of nutrition. The variety of textures and flavors available allowed medieval cooks to create complex taste experiences, even when working with relatively simple ingredients. Beverages, from sacred to profane. The culture of wine. Medieval castle life revolved around wine in ways that might surprise modern observers. While we might think of wine as primarily an alcoholic beverage consumed for pleasure, in medieval times it served multiple functions that made it essential to daily life. Wine was often safer to drink than water, which might be contaminated with diseases. It provided calories and nutrients that supplemented the medieval diet, and it served important social and symbolic functions that defined relationships between different social classes. The Saint-Aliquois region produced its own wine for ordinary consumption, and this local vintage represented the foundation of the castle's beverage program. Picture vast vineyards stretching across the hillsides around the castle, tended by peasants who had inherited their vine-growing knowledge from generations of ancestors. The grape harvest was one of the most important events of the agricultural year, involving the entire community in a celebration that combined hard labor with festive celebration. Local wine production created economic connections that extended far beyond the immediate region. Some of the Saint Aloysius wine was shipped to Paris and even exported to distant markets in Flanders and England. This trade connected the castle to international commercial networks and brought in the silver and gold that funded other aspects of castle life. However, local wine was just the beginning of the castle's beverage collection. The more famous vintages of other French regions commanded premium prices and were reserved for special occasions. Wine from Gascony, Saintonge, Mâcon, Reims, the Marne region, and the Orléanais each had distinctive characteristics that medieval palates could distinguish and appreciate. The most desirable French wine was that of Saint-Pourçain in Auvergne, and Baron Conon maintained a carefully cherished tun of this precious vintage in his cellars. This wine was so highly regarded that poems were written in its praise, celebrating it as a beverage which you drink for the good of your health. The storage and preservation of such valuable wine required considerable expertise and investment in proper cellaring facilities. International luxury beverages. For occasions of the greatest state and ceremony, imported wines from distant lands would be produced to demonstrate the host's wealth and international connections. These exotic beverages were valued as much for their rarity and expense as for their taste, serving as visible symbols of the host's ability to command resources from across the known world. Heady Cyprian and Lesbian wines from the Levant represented the ultimate in luxury beverages. These wines had traveled thousands of miles, changing hands multiple times, and accumulating costs at each stage of their journey. By the time they reached a French castle, they represented investments comparable to the cost of a war horse or a year's income for a skilled craftsman. Spanish Aquilian wine and German Rhenish provided additional options for hosts seeking to impress their guests with international sophistication. The Rhenish wines, being less distant, were somewhat more affordable than the Mediterranean varieties, but they still represented significant luxury items that were brought out only for the most important occasions. The serving of these imported wines was itself an elaborate ceremony. Special goblets might be used, and the wine would be presented with appropriate fanfare to ensure that all guests understood the magnitude of the hospitality being offered. The host might explain the wine's origins and the difficulties involved in obtaining it, turning the beverage service into a form of entertainment and education. The world of fermented alternatives. Wine wasn't the only alcoholic beverage available to medieval castle dwellers. In northern France, the region around Saint-Aloysius represented a dividing zone between the land of the winepress and the land of the brewhouse, creating a culture where both wine and beer were produced and consumed regularly. Beer production was a major operation that required dedicated facilities and considerable expertise. The castle maintained a great brew house that rivaled the monastery's brewing operation. Medieval beer was quite different from modern varieties, being made exclusively from barley, without the hops that would later become standard. This created a sweeter, less bitter beverage that modern beer drinkers might find surprisingly mild. The brewing process itself was both art and science, requiring careful attention to temperature, timing, and ingredients. The barley had to be malted, allowed to germinate and then dried, to convert its starches into fermentable sugars. The brewing water had to be of good quality, which was one reason why monasteries and castles were often located near reliable springs or clean streams. Different grades of beer served different social functions. Really fine beer was called god ale, derived from the German words for good and ale, or sometimes double beer, for its strength and quality. This premium beverage was reserved for special occasions and honored guests. Common beer, known as small beer, had lower alcohol content and served as the everyday beverage for castle inhabitants of all ranks. The influence of the Crusades had reached even into brewing practices. Spiced beer was growing in popularity, charged with exotic ingredients like juniper, resin, gentian, cinnamon, and other aromatics imported from distant lands. These additions transformed the original taste so completely that the resulting beverage bore little resemblance to traditional beer, creating entirely new categories of fermented drinks. Regional specialties and unusual beverages. The seasonal cycle brought its own beverage traditions, particularly in autumn, when the apple and pear harvests provided raw materials for cider and perry production. The peasants would engage in enthusiastic cider making that often led to spectacular drunkenness when these beverages fermented and became alcoholic. However, outside of Normandy, where cider was a regional specialty, these fruit-based drinks seldom appealed to castlefolk who preferred the more sophisticated flavors of wine and beer. The medieval beverage repertoire included many drinks that we would barely recognize today. Substitute wines were common, really infusions of herbs like wormwood, hyssop, and rosemary that were consumed primarily for their supposed medicinal benefits. These herbal drinks were believed to clear the system and promote health, reflecting the medieval understanding of medicine that emphasized the balance of bodily humors. More appealing to modern tastes would have been nectar, a sweet drink made from spices, Asiatic aromatics, and honey. This beverage represented a significant investment in imported ingredients and was genuinely popular among those who could afford it. The preparation required skill in balancing the various flavoring elements to create a harmonious and pleasant drink. One of the most unusual beverages consumed at St. Alekis was syrah, made from buttermilk that was fermented, boiled with onions and garlic, then cooled in closed vessels. The resulting drink was, according to contemporary accounts, definitely an acquired taste that strangers found difficult to enjoy. This represents the kind of regional specialty that developed in isolation, becoming beloved by local populations while remaining incomprehensible to outsiders. The dawn of distilled spirits. At the very edges of medieval beverage culture, we begin to see the earliest hints of what would later become distilled spirits. Some physicians prescribed a mysterious substance called water of gold, claiming it could prolong health, dissipate superfluous matters, revive the spirits, and promote youth. They also claimed it greatly assisted the cure of colic, dropsy, paralysis, and ague. This early form of what would later be called brandy was still primarily regarded as medicine rather than a recreational beverage. It was extremely expensive and rare, available only to the wealthiest households, and used sparingly for its supposed therapeutic benefits. The distillation process was not yet well understood, and the resulting spirits were crude compared to later developments in the art. The very existence of such beverages points to the experimental nature of medieval cuisine, and the constant search for new luxury items that could demonstrate wealth and sophistication. Physicians and alchemists were constantly seeking new substances that might have beneficial effects, and the line between medicine and cuisine was often blurred in ways that would seem strange to modern sensibilities. Daily rhythms, the pattern of medieval meals. Morning beginnings. The daily rhythm of castle life was punctuated by meals that served functions far beyond simple nutrition. The day began with what we would recognize as a very light breakfast, typically just bread and wine, consumed shortly after rising. This modest meal provided just enough sustenance to begin the day's activities, without the heavy feeling that would interfere with morning tasks. However, when particularly arduous work was anticipated, the morning meal might be expanded. Picture, if you will, a young squire approaching his lord early in the morning, carrying a favorite pasty because, as the epic poetry of the time noted, eating early in the morning brings health and gives one greater courage and spirit. This understanding of food as fuel for both body and morale was fundamental to medieval thinking about nutrition. The timing of the main meal of the day, dinner, might surprise modern diners. This substantial repast could begin as early as 9 in the morning, reflecting a daily schedule that was organized around the natural rhythms of daylight and the demands of agricultural and military life. The early timing of dinner meant that a good part of the day's business would be conducted after this heavy meal, as people worked off the effects of substantial eating. Evening customs. The evening meal presented interesting variations depending on circumstances and the social obligations of the household. Sometimes, when dinner had been served late in the day, no regular supper would be provided. Instead, when guests retired for the night, attendants would bring cakes, fruits, and wine to their chambers. This practice reflected the medieval understanding that heavy eating late in the day was unhealthy and could interfere with sleep. The approach to guest hospitality was characterized by abundance and insistence that bordered on the aggressive. Medieval hosts considered it their duty to make guests eat and drink as much as possible, sometimes employing elaborate deceptions to ensure that visitors consumed more than they might have chosen. There's a remarkable story of the Count of Guernsey, who was so determined to be hospitable that he not only forced any knight passing through his lands to attend a feast, but also kept quantities of white wine always available, so that when visitors asked to have their red wine diluted with water, they could be deceived by seeing white liquid mixed into their goblets. In this way, he once succeeded in rendering an entire bishop's retinue gloriously intoxicated. The philosophy of perfect dining. Medieval thinkers gave considerable attention to the elements that made for an ideal dining experience. Consider the thoughtful analysis provided by Bartolomeus of Granvilla, who identified 12 essential requirements for a perfect banquet. These requirements reveal the sophisticated understanding medieval hosts had of the complex factors that contributed to successful entertaining. The first requirement was a suitable hour, not too early nor too late, reflecting the understanding that timing was crucial to the success of any gathering. The second was a pleasant place, acknowledging that environment profoundly affected the dining experience. A gracious and liberal host was the third requirement, emphasizing the personal qualities that made hospitality successful. Plenty to eat, allowing guests to choose their preferred dishes, formed the fourth requirement, while the fifth ensured the same abundance applied to beverages. Willing servants were the sixth necessity, recognizing that reluctant or surly service could destroy even the finest meal. Agreeable company was the seventh requirement, acknowledging that the social dynamics of the gathering were as important as the food and drink. Pleasant music, the eighth requirement, reflected the medieval understanding that all the senses should be engaged in creating a memorable experience. Plenty of light was the ninth necessity, important in an age when artificial lighting was expensive and often inadequate. Good cooking, surprisingly, was only the 10th requirement, suggesting that while important, culinary skill was just one element among many that contributed to successful entertaining. A seasonable conclusion was the 11th requirement, emphasizing the importance of knowing when to end the festivities before they became tedious or descended into disorder. Finally, quiet and repose afterward was the 12th requirement, acknowledging that guests needed time to recover from the intense social and sensory experience of a major feast. The art of service, medieval table customs, the hierarchy of attendance. The service at medieval feasts was organized with military precision, reflecting the hierarchical nature of feudal society and the importance of demonstrating proper social relationships through the rituals of hospitality. The tables for notable guests were served by two distinct classes of attendants, each with specific roles and responsibilities that reinforced the social order. The first class consisted of the baron's 3 squires, supplemented on grand occasions by several young nobles who had actually received knighthood. These young men of noble birth wore resplendent bliots of colored silk with fur trimmings, their clothing itself a display of the wealth and status of the household they served. Most dishes would be passed to them by the second class of servants, soberly clad villains of peasant stock, then presented on bended knee by noble hands to noble guests. This elaborate system ensured that food never passed directly from peasant hands to noble mouths, maintaining the social distinctions that were considered essential to proper order. The young nobles who served at table were not diminished by this service. Rather, they were fulfilling an important part of their education and demonstrating their worthiness to eventually command others. The entire service operation was supervised by Sire Eustace, the old seneschal, who commanded his platoons of attendants with the same precision he might use to organize the castle's military defenses. His experience and authority ensured that service proceeded smoothly, even when hundreds of guests had to be fed simultaneously. The education of service. For young nobles, learning to wait at table was an essential part of their education, a skill they might need to employ throughout their lives unless they achieved the highest ranks of nobility. Even kings and emperors expected to be served by men of noble birth, making competent table service a valuable and necessary accomplishment. The training of these young servers was remarkably thorough and detailed. They learned to stand at perfect ease, maintaining dignity while remaining alert to the needs of their superiors. They were taught not to roll their eyes or stare blankly, behaviors that would suggest boredom or disrespect. They learned to control their expressions, laughing only when guests were laughing, maintaining appropriate solemnity during serious conversations. Personal hygiene and presentation were emphasized repeatedly. Servers were required to keep their fingernails clean and their hands well washed, important considerations in an age when personal cleanliness was often neglected. When they sat at table themselves, these young nobles were expected to be models of propriety, demonstrating through their behavior the standards expected of their class. The rules governing their eating behavior were remarkably specific and comprehensive. They were taught not to gobble their food, but to eat with measured dignity. Before consuming their own portions, They were required to put a little food from every plate into the basket of collected leavings for the poor, demonstrating charity and concern for those less fortunate. Conversation during meals was carefully regulated. They were not to chatter unnecessarily, fill their mouths too full, or chew on both sides of the mouth simultaneously. They learned not to laugh or talk with food in their mouths, not to make noise while eating, and not to handle cats or dogs during mealtimes. Table hygiene was equally important. They were forbidden to wipe their knives on the tablecloth, pick their teeth publicly, wipe their noses with their fingers, or spit across or beyond the table. The architecture of dining. The physical arrangement of medieval dining was both practical and symbolic, reflecting social hierarchies while accommodating the logistical challenges of feeding large numbers of people. The tables themselves were nearly always long and narrow, a design that maximized seating while making it possible for servers to reach all diners efficiently. In the Great Hall, the principal tables were fixed structures made of heavy oak planks, massive enough to remain stable even when loaded with the weight of elaborate feast preparations. However, the medieval household also maintained numerous lighter tables made of boards that could be set on horses, portable supports that allowed the seneschal to quickly reconfigure dining arrangements. If the weather was pleasant, he might suddenly announce, "The weather is fine. Monsieur will dine in the garden," requiring the rapid relocation of the entire dining operation. The seating arrangements reflected and reinforced social hierarchies with almost mathematical precision. The most favored guests were provided with cushions, a luxury that marked their elevated status. In the Great Hall, the Baron and his immediate friends and family occupied the long master seat on the dais, facing the company with the Baron's chair prominently positioned under a canopy. This canopy was far more than decorative. It was a powerful symbol of seigneurial privilege that would follow the Baron wherever he dined. Even when eating in the garden, a canopy would be erected over his seat, and he would surrender this place of honor only when entertaining a superior, such as his suzerain duke, or when special circumstances, such as a wedding celebration, required different arrangements. The ritual of table setting. The preparation of tables for a medieval feast was an art form that required considerable skill and attention to detail. Enormous tablecloths had to be spread smoothly across the long tables, without wrinkles or uneven areas that might interfere with the placement of dishes or the comfort of diners. Napkins were folded with precise attention to appearance and placed at each seat according to established patterns. The distribution of eating utensils was a matter of considerable ceremony and security. At each place, servers would set a suitable drinking vessel and the essential eating implements, a knife and spoon. Forks were not yet in use, so diners relied on knives for cutting and spoons for liquids, using their fingers for most other eating tasks. These utensils, made of gold or silver, represented a significant portion of the castle's portable wealth. The seneschal personally supervised their distribution and was responsible for counting every piece both before and after the meal. The loss of even a single spoon could represent a substantial financial blow to the household, making this careful inventory an essential part of feast management. The knives provided to diners were serious implements with sharp steel blades, designed for the substantial work of cutting through tough medieval meats. The drinking vessels often took bizarre and artistic forms: lions, birds, and dragons, crafted by skilled metalworkers who combined functionality with artistic expression. For guests of lower rank, there were huge cups carved from wood and large jacks, made of leather, materials that were less valuable but still functional. At every place, servers would set a good-sized cake made of fine white flour, which would serve multiple purposes during the meal. Between every two places, there would be a large porringer made of pewter or silver, designed to be shared by each pair of guests. This sharing arrangement was both economical and social, requiring diners to coordinate their eating and creating opportunities for conversation and interaction. The ceremony of entry. The transition from everyday life to the formal world of the feast was marked by elaborate ceremonies that prepared guests for the special experience ahead. The signal for the meal was always the loud blast of trumpets, a sound that sent both mighty and humble bustling toward the dining area, whether it was located in the garden or the great hall. On ordinary days, the process was relatively informal, characterized by good-natured jostling and scrambling as hungry people responded to their appetites. Medieval people lived close to nature and were always conscious of their physical needs, making the call to meals an urgent and welcome sound. However, wedding feasts and other grand occasions required more elaborate procedures. Upon entering the special banqueting tent, each guest was met by two handsome varlets who performed the essential ritual of hand-washing. The first servant held a water jug and small basin, pouring water dexterously over each guest's fingers. The second varlet immediately wiped the hands dry, ensuring that no guest proceeded to table with wet or dirty hands. This hand-washing ceremony was far more than a hygienic necessity. It was an important social ritual that provided opportunities for interaction and even flirtation among young people. During their betrothal, Olivier and Aliénor had found great delight in passing the towel to each other during this preliminary ceremony, using the required ritual as an excuse for intimate contact and meaningful glances. Each guest waited patiently until all persons ahead in the line of precedence had enjoyed this courtesy, reinforcing social hierarchies even in this simple preliminary to the meal. The order of precedence was strictly observed, visiting clergy first, then visiting knights, then the seigneur's family, and so forth, down the social hierarchy. The diplomacy of seating. The placement of guests at medieval feast was a matter of supreme diplomatic importance that could have consequences extending far beyond the immediate social gathering. The deliberations between Baron Conon and the sage sire Eustace over seating arrangements represented some of the most delicate negotiations in medieval social life. Certain positions were standardized by protocol and tradition. At Olivier's wedding feast, the bride and groom naturally took the place of honor under the canopy. The officiating bishop sat at Olivier's right hand, reflecting the church's high status in medieval society. The suzerain Duke of Quelquepart sat at the bishop's right, while Olivier's left was occupied by the bride and the Count and Countess of Persain. However, beyond these obvious placements, the seating arrangements became intensely complex and politically sensitive. The presence of a dozen other counts and barons, each accompanied by their wives, created a diplomatic nightmare. Each guest had to be seated according to their relative rank, wealth, and relationship to the host. But these factors often conflicted with each other in ways that made perfect solutions impossible. The consequences of seating mistakes could be severe and long-lasting. Blood feuds had actually started from failures to seat guests properly, as nobles interpreted their table placement as a public statement of their relative worth and status. Would the old rival Fortvert accept being seated farther from the canopy than the Count of Marek, who was richer and of more ancient lineage? Such questions required supreme diplomatic skill and intimate knowledge of the complex web of relationships among the feudal nobility. The pairing of dining companions added another layer of complexity to these arrangements. Medieval custom required that, as far as possible, a lady be placed beside each cavalier. These pairs would share the same dish and the same goblet throughout the entire feast, making the selection of partners a matter that could affect personal relationships for years to come. The choice of dining partner was obviously another opportunity for testing one's social skills and political acumen. The grand performance, serving the wedding banquet. The ceremonial beginning. The commencement of the wedding feast was itself a theatrical performance designed to honor the bridal couple, while demonstrating the wealth and organizational capabilities of the host. After grace was offered by the bishop, a reminder of the religious framework that governed all aspects of medieval life, an endless procession began between the cookhouse and the banqueting place. Picture this elaborate choreography. Boys running with great dishes, their faces flushed with excitement and exertion, committing their precious burdens to more official servitors who would carry them to the guests. The entire operation required split-second timing and coordination, as hundreds of dishes had to be prepared, transported, and served while still at the proper temperature. The entrance of the first course was a solemn moment that marked the true beginning of the feast. The bridal tent fell silent as, with a clash of cymbals and a bray of trumpets, Sire Eustace appeared in the entrance wearing a bright scarlet blayot and waving his white wand of office. Behind him came all the squires and upper servants, each carrying shoulder-high a huge dish of some specially prepared delicacy. This ceremonial entrance served multiple purposes beyond the practical necessity of bringing food to the table. It demonstrated the hierarchical organization of the household, showcased the wealth invested in the feast, and provided a moment of theater that heightened the emotional impact of the occasion. The clash of cymbals and bray of trumpets announced to everyone present that this was no ordinary meal, but a celebration worthy of the most elaborate presentation. The art of carving. The presentation of the great haunch of stag that anchored the first course required considerable skill and ceremony. The Baron's carver was a specialist whose abilities were considered as important as those of any other craftsman in the castle. He held the meat by 2 fingers and a thumb, the absence of forks requiring a delicate touch that could control the meat while wielding the carving knife with surgical precision. 2 jongleurs provided musical accompaniment to this carving ceremony, their flutes creating a festive atmosphere while the carver performed his skilled work. The carver's technique was closely watched by all the guests, as his skill reflected directly on the household's quality and sophistication. A clumsy carver could ruin even the finest meat, while a master carver could make even ordinary joints appear magnificent. The cupbearers faced their own challenges in maintaining the dignity of the service. They had to fill the flagons without spilling a single drop, a task that required steady hands and considerable practice when working with heavy vessels and valuable wines. Even the bride and groom, despite the emotional intensity of their special day, found themselves ready for the venison once the ceremony of presentation was complete. The reality of medieval dining. The actual process of eating at a medieval feast would strike modern diners as remarkably primitive and messy. The banqueters had little need for individual plates in the modern sense. Instead, they took the loaves of bread that lay ready at each place, hacked them into thick slices, and placed pieces of meat directly on these bread trenchers. The bread served as both plate and utensil, absorbing the juices from the meat and providing a way to consume every bit of the valuable food. These trenchers would not ordinarily be eaten during the feast itself. Instead, they went into the great alms basket for distribution to the poor, along with meat scraps and other leavings. This practice served both practical and moral purposes, ensuring that nothing was wasted while providing charity for those in need. However, the most distinguished guests enjoyed a significant luxury. Silver plates were placed under their bread trenchers, providing a more elegant dining surface and preventing the valuable tablecloths from being soiled. For most guests, the bare tablecloth provided the only bottom surface for their improvised plates. The presence of the Baron's dogs at every meal was considered a prescriptive right rather than a breach of etiquette. These animals served as living garbage disposals, consuming whatever scraps fell from the tables or were deliberately thrown to them. Early in the feast, the Duke of Kelkopart demonstrated his benevolent mood by tossing a slice of venison to a fine boarhound, an act that would have been seen as both generous and appropriate. The progression of courses. Medieval feast organization differed significantly from modern dining in its approach to courses and food sequencing. Rather than the carefully planned progression from lighter to heavier foods that characterizes contemporary formal dining, medieval feasts were designed to tempt the appetite to utter satiety by forcing first one dish and then another upon the feasters. There wasn't really a logical sequence of courses in the modern sense. Most dishes were heavy, and since vegetables were considered common food, appropriate for everyday consumption, the average banquet seemed to consist of one succession after another of varieties of meat. This approach reflected both the medieval understanding of nutrition and the desire to demonstrate wealth through the conspicuous consumption of expensive foods. The typical progression for the wedding feast included 3 main courses, each featuring multiple types of meat, prepared in different ways. The first course offered slices of stag, boar's head larded with herb sauce, beef, mutton, legs of pork, swan, roasted rabbit, and pastry tarts. The second course featured pottage of drope and rose, mallard, pheasant, and roast capon, and pasties filled with small birds. The third course included rabbits and gravy, heavily spiced with onion and saffron, roasted teal, woodcock and snipe, and patties filled with egg yolks, cheese, and cinnamon, along with pork pies. The absence of salads, ices, or confectionery in the modern sense didn't mean the feast lacked impressive presentations. Some dishes were superb examples of medieval culinary artistry, designed as much to impress the eye as to satisfy the appetite. Spectacular presentations. Among the most impressive presentations was the swan, which appeared with full musical accompaniment. The bird was prepared and presented as if it were still alive and swimming, its beak gilded and its body silvered. It rested on a mass of green pastry, designed to represent a grass field, surrounded by little banners that transformed the dish into a work of art. The entire presentation was placed on a carpet of silk when it was set on the table, emphasizing its status as both food and spectacle. An alternative spectacular presentation might feature a peacock with its full plumage, restored and outspread, creating a display that honored both the skill of the kitchen staff and the wealth of the host. These elaborate presentations required considerable advanced planning and artistic skill, as the birds had to be carefully skinned, cooked, and then reassembled in ways that created the illusion of life. However, the most dramatic moment of the entire feast came toward its conclusion with the presentation of an enormous pasty that had been constructed specifically for theatrical effect. Amid an expectant hush, Baron Conan rose from his seat and ceremonially slashed the pasty open with his dagger. Instantly, a score of little birds fluttered out and began dashing frantically about the tent. This moment of surprise and delight was carefully choreographed. Immediately, the Baron's falconers, who had been standing ready at the entrance, stepped forward with grins of anticipation. They unhooded a second score of hawks, which in a twinkling pounced after the trapped birds and killed them to the shouts and delight of the feasters right above the dining tables. The resulting confusion was part of the entertainment, rustling by the ladies, merry scrambling by the men, and general excitement as the squawking hawks were eventually caught, hooded, and taken away. This spectacle represented the ultimate fusion of dining and entertainment, transforming the meal into a memorable experience that guests would discuss for years afterward. The constant din of celebration. From beginning to end, the feast was characterized by noise, conversation, and general merriment that created an atmosphere of celebration rather than the quiet dignity we might associate with formal dining. Everybody talked at once, creating a constant buzz of conversation that rose and fell with the various presentations and entertainments. The appearance of each impressive dish sparked its own wave of comment and discussion. The presentation of the stag immediately started innumerable hunting stories as guests competed to share their own experiences and adventures. The Duke felt obligated to regale his loyal lieges with the tale of how he had slain a bear, providing entertainment that was considered as important as the food itself. Even disruptions were accepted as part of the festive atmosphere. When two of the Baron's dogs began fighting and almost upset the chair of a countess, the incident was treated as merely another source of amusement, rather than a serious breach of decorum. The tolerance for such disruptions reflected the medieval understanding that feasts were meant to be lively, participatory events, rather than solemn ceremonies. Alternative celebrations, the fast day feast. Religious constraints and culinary creativity. Medieval cooks faced their greatest creative challenges when required to prepare elaborate dinners for so-called fast days, when church law prohibited the consumption of meat. However, these restrictions, rather than limiting culinary possibilities, often inspired remarkable innovations that demonstrated the sophistication and adaptability of medieval cuisine. Fast day menus could still provide abundant variety and impressive presentations while remaining within the commands of the church. Rather than simply serving fish as a substitute for meat, skilled cooks created entirely parallel cuisines that were often as elaborate and satisfying as their meat-based counterparts. A typical fast day banquet might begin with roast apples garnished with sorrel and rosemary, creating a dish that was both visually appealing and flavorful. This would be followed by rich soups that demonstrated remarkable complexity despite their fish-based ingredients. One such soup combined trout, herring, eels that had been salted for exactly 24 hours and salt whiting, soaked for precisely 12 hours, all enhanced with almonds, ginger, saffron, and cinnamon powder. The abundance of aquatic options. When it was possible to transport them from the ocean, fast day feasts could feature remarkable varieties of saltwater fish, soles, congers, turbots, and salmon. However, even when such luxury items were not available, the rivers and streams of the region provided abundant alternatives. pike, preferably those bearing roe, carp, and bream, could create impressive presentations that satisfied both religious requirements and aristocratic expectations. Side dishes expanded the possibilities even further. Lampreys, porpoise, mackerel, and shad could be served with sophisticated accompaniments, like juice of crab apples, rice, and fried almonds. These combinations demonstrated the medieval cook's ability to create complex flavors and textures using ingredients that modern diners might find unusual or challenging. The culmination of such feasts often featured stewed or fresh fruits, figs, dates, grapes, and filberts, accompanied by spiced wine known as hippocras. This sweet conclusion provided a satisfying end to meals that might otherwise have seemed overly focused on fish and vegetables. Comparing feast and fast. To minds of later ages, these fast day dinners might seem only slightly less indulgent than orthodox feasts featuring meat. The quantities consumed were still enormous, the preparations were equally elaborate, and the variety of dishes was comparable to any meat-based celebration. The primary difference lay in the specific ingredients used, rather than in the overall approach to hospitality and abundance. This similarity between feast and fast day meals reflected both the ingenuity of medieval cooks and the fundamental understanding that important social occasions required impressive food presentations, regardless of religious constraints. The ability to create memorable dining experiences within the limitations imposed by church law demonstrated the sophistication of medieval culinary culture and the importance of hospitality in maintaining social relationships. The conclusion of celebration. The ritual of ending. Even the most elaborate medieval feast had to come to an end, and the conclusion was marked by rituals that were as carefully observed as those that had begun the celebration. As the elaborate presentations wound down and the final courses were served, attention turned to the traditional ending foods that signaled the approaching conclusion of the festivities. The concluding baked pears, peeled walnuts, dates, and figs represented both the end of the meal and a gesture toward the exotic trade networks that brought such luxuries to northern French tables. The noble dames chewed their unfamiliar sugar plums, tiny portions of an almost impossibly expensive sweetener that demonstrated the host's willingness to spare no expense for his guests' pleasure. A final cup of spiced wine was handed around the tables, providing a last opportunity for toasts and expressions of goodwill. Despite the abundance of alcohol that had been consumed throughout the long feast, the guests remained in control of their faculties, merry and talkative, but not so intoxicated as to create embarrassment or disorder. Charity and social responsibility. Before rising from the tables, the guests participated in a ritual that demonstrated the social obligations that accompanied privilege and abundance. They had all very properly thought of the poor, calling in the servitors and piling all the loose food upon great platters to be kept for distribution to the needy. This wasn't merely a token gesture, but a substantial redistribution of wealth that provided real relief to the indigent population of the region. On the day of the feast itself, all the poor in the surrounding area were eating voraciously at the outer tables, participating in the celebration according to their station. On the morrow of the festival, a great collection of halt, sickly, and shiftless individuals would gather around the barbican in just expectation that Conan and Adela would order a distribution of the remaining food. The final ceremonies. The bishop's return of thanks marked the formal conclusion of the religious aspects of the feast, acknowledging the divine providence that had made such abundance possible. The reappearance of basins, pitchers, and towels for the final hand-washing ceremony provided a mirror image of the preliminary rituals that had begun the feast. As guests rose from the tables, they faced choices that reflected their individual interests and energy levels. Some chose to mingle with the less exalted visitors, who had been dining outside the main pavilion. Others sought repose under the shade trees, recovering from the intense social and sensory experience they had just endured. Many gravitated toward the jongleurs who were tuning their instruments, preparing for the musical entertainment that would continue the celebration. However, the younger guests, their energy restored by the feast, began preparing for what many considered the best part of any celebration, the vigorous dancing that would extend the festivities well into the evening hours. The broader celebration. Outside the state pavilion, the festivities had followed a different but parallel course. The service had naturally been less ceremonious and the fare less sumptuous, but the principle of abundance and inclusion had been maintained. All of the countryside had been welcome to wander into the castle gardens and partake of the hospitality offered. Picture the scene: greasy, unkempt villains elbowing up to the long tables, snatching joints of meat with hands that knew hard labor, bawling to the servitors to refill their leather flagons, and throwing bits of cheese and bread around in what the nobles might consider an outrageously wasteful manner. Yet this apparent waste served important social functions. Thousands of persons, many of whom would be fortunate to have black bread throughout the coming winter, were trying to avenge past hunger by consuming and drinking as much as possible. Sire Eustace found himself continually calling for more supplies: another ton of wine, another vat of beer, another quarter of beef. These provisions for the multitude were not select, but they provided bread, flesh, and drink without stinting. The generosity was genuine and substantial, creating memories and obligations that would bind the community together through the challenges of the coming year. The gradual wind down. As the shadows lengthened and the afternoon progressed toward evening, a satisfying exhaustion began to settle over the celebration. The villains and petty nobles set down their flagons, their immediate hunger and thirst finally satisfied. Groups of friends, if they retained sufficient sobriety, began to sing songs in rounds, with each member improvising doggerel verses while the entire group thundered out familiar choruses. However, many guests no longer retained sufficient mental clarity for such organized recreations. While their noble hosts continued with dancing and more structured entertainments, the others threw themselves down on the grass in informal companies, content to watch and listen to the jongleurs who provided ongoing entertainment. The conclusion of the wedding dances brought Olivier and Eleanor out of the great tent to take their seats on flower-wreathed chairs before the principal minstrels. Their presence lent some decorum to what might otherwise have descended into disgracefully confused and coarse reveling, demonstrating the ongoing social obligations that accompanied their new status as a married couple. For a truly great feast, the jongleurs were almost as indispensable as the cooks themselves, providing the entertainment that transformed a mere meal into a memorable celebration that would be discussed and remembered for years to come. Reflections on Medieval Hospitality. As we reach the end of our peaceful journey through the medieval world of cookery and mealtimes, we can appreciate the remarkable complexity and sophistication of castle hospitality in 12th century France. What might initially appear to modern eyes as crude and primitive reveals itself, upon closer examination, to be a highly developed system of social organization, culinary artistry, and community building.